Hi students, today we're going to learn about how to keep records for our salmon project. Any good scientist always keeps good data and records so we can look back and see what went wrong, what worked, and to keep those records and compare them to records in the future or records in the past so we can find common patterns. It's also important to keep these records because these fish are part of the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife Salmon Trout Enhancement Program. And each school or group or classroom that is participating in this project needs to turn in their records to the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Department so they can keep track of all the salmon eggs that are being released in the rivers and which eggs are surviving and which ones have hatched. So it's important to keep good records. So let's talk about the records we're going to be keeping for our salmon. Here is a copy of the salmon data records that we're going to be keeping. It's important that each day we record our data on these sheets. Let's take a closer look inside this data sheet to see the data we'll be recording. Okay, so if you can see, we will be recording each day the number of eggs that have died or the number of fry that have died, as you can see here. A second thing is right here is the water temperature. Every day we need to record the water temperature because that will help us determine the temperature units, and I'll be showing you what the temperature units are in just a minute. And then our accumulate temperature units. Each day we'll also need to record the pH balance, the ammonia, and any kind of comments. So November 10th is the day that we picked up the eggs from the Fish and Wildlife Department. So you can see we had 300 eggs, but no eggs died. And the fry is the name of what we call the eggs after they hatch. So no eggs have hatched. The water temperature was 50 degrees. And the Fish and Wildlife Department specialist told us that the ATUs were 580. So now let's record today's data. Today is November 11th. We did have, as you remember from our video, there were 12 eggs that have died, so we need to keep track of that. So we're going to add 12 right there. Again, the fry is when the fish have hatched. We've had no fry yet. Our temperature, if you'll remember, yesterday we recorded was 50 degrees. So I'm going to put 50 in there. I'm going to come back to the temperature units in just a minute. Now, at the end of our testing, it was 7.0 was our pH, which was just about right. But one of the comments, and the ammonia, we have not recorded any ammonia right now. We'll start tracking ammonia after the fish have hatched. So in the comments section, I do want to make note that the pH was at 7.6, but we had to lower it. So I'm going to type in 7.6 was the pH, and that we reduced it. pH down. So that way we have a record of that. So now let's talk about temperature units. A temperature unit is every degree over 32 degrees, which is the freezing level, is considered one temperature unit. So if we had 33 degrees, the temperature units would be 1. If we had 35 degrees, the temperature units would be 3. So if I had 40 degrees was our tank, what would our temperature units be? Yes, the answer is 8. That's great. So now with 50 degrees, which is what our tank is set at, how many temperature units would we have? If you answered 18, that's correct. So we're going to record 18 temperature units. Now temperature units help us determine how fast or how slow the salmon will grow. So the colder the temperature, the slower they will grow. And the warmer the temperature, the faster they will grow. So helping us keep track of how many temperature units is important for us to determine when the eggs will hatch and when the eggs will be ready to release in the river. So now let's talk about accumulated temperature units. Accumulated temperature units is when we add the temperature units each day to the previous accumulated temperature units. So if we look at 580 accumulated temperature units is when we picked up the fish, and we add the 18, we now come up with 598 temperature units. Okay, so why do we try and keep track of temperature units or accumulated temperature units? Well, this information can tell us when we can expect the salmon eggs to hatch and when we can expect the salmon to release in the streams. So if we look up a little bit closer into this, our chart, this chart will tell us exactly when we can expect these things to happen. Now, the eggs we've been given from the Fish and Wildlife Department are spring Chinook, which is on the top row of this chart. So you can see at what we call is the eyes stage is when we got the eggs. This is when you can start to see the eyes inside the eggs. If you'll remember, we got our eggs from the Fish and Wildlife Department, and they were at 560. So this is right at the eye stage. And right now, we're still in the eye stage. Because if you will recall from our data that we collected, we were just at about 580 accumulated temperature units. We know that they will hatch when they get to 850 or 900 accumulated temperature units. And when the accumulated temperature units get to 1650, that's about the time that we'll be releasing them in the river. So let's see how we can predict, based on the information we have about our fish, when we can expect them to hatch. Okay, now let's take the information we've collected and the data we've collected to predict when our salmon will hatch. We'll use this worksheet to help us take us through this process. So the first step is to determine what is the total temperature units required for hatching. If you will recall from the chart we had just used, we learned that for Chinook, spring Chinook salmon, which is the type of salmon that we have, temperature units for hatching is 850 to 900. So we're going to type in our first column, 850 temperature units. So let me zoom in a little bit closer so you can see as we put these figures in. The second piece of data we're going to input is the thermal units at hatchery, or in this case, what are the thermal units today, November 11th, after we've had our fish eggs for one day. If you recall, again, from our data sheets, that number was 598. Whoops, so we're going to put that number right in here, 598. Okay, so now we need to just figure out how many thermal units are still needed. So we will subtract the 598 from the 850, and what is that number? Okay, did you get the number 252? If so, that's the number that is correct. So now let's add what is the average water temperature in our tank. Again, if you'll remember from our previous videos, we're keeping our tank at 50 degrees, so we're going to input that number right here. So what does that mean our average temperature units are for each day? Again, if you remember, temperature units are for every degree over 32 degrees, which is freezing, that's one temperature unit. So 50 minus 32 would make 18. So let's plug 18 right into there. So now we next go into the thermal units still needed. So this is the number above, which is right here, thermal units still needed. And that number was 252. So we're going to plug that number right in here. And now we'll divide that number by the average temperature units accumulated each day, which was this number right here that we already calculated. So that is 18. So now to figure out how many days before hatching, we're going to divide 18 into 252. Can you help us figure out what that number is? Okay, if you figured out 14, that is correct. So that means 14 days from today, which is November 11th, is when we anticipate our salmon eggs to hatch. So if we add 14 days to November 11th, that would mean our fish will be hatching on November 25th. And again, this is an approximation. Some fish might hatch a little bit before and some after. And if you recall from our chart, it said the fish will hatch anytime between 850 and 900 temperature units. November 25th, we'll be at 850 temperature units. So we'll be checking back around that time to see if our salmon eggs are hatching. In the meanwhile, we'll be checking them from time to time to see how our eggs are doing and to check our water quality, our pH, and those kinds of things. So until then, we'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.